Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place, though today's case is going to be a bit special, given I'll be tackling a triumvirate of titles. Specifically, Dust developer David Szymanski's narrative trilogy, The Moon Sliver, The Music Machine, and A Wolf in Autumn. Join me as I navigate through nightmarish narratives, wander through desolate domains, and take in the grim sights and sounds. So I can only share whether I should have walked out on this experience or if this was a journey worth taking. Now, while we are covering a broader range of games than normal, they're a bit more digestible compared to my usual fare, which means we're going to cover this in parts, similarly to my DreadX collection videos. So, without further ado, I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's get started with the Moon Sliver. Perhaps once the island was home, to you and to the others. But something changed, leaving you to wander alone through the husks of hearths and homesteads, searching for some semblance of meaning from the wisps of nostalgia which cling to once familiar objects, to ascertain just when things began to truly go wrong, or perhaps simply to pass the time. Ultimately, the answer rests with the player and their willingness to engage with the island, since while the Moon Sliver is a narrative-oriented experience, it's a bit particular insofar as its presentation style. Which is to say, through the act of clicking on certain mundane objects or moving to certain spots, you'll gradually earn slivers of story to sift through. It's through these tidbits that you're gradually provided a snapshot of the island, its inhabitants, their mysterious beliefs, and their ultimate decline. That said, these memories aren't spoon-fed to the player in a linear order, nor is there any form of journal provided to compile them together, leaving it entirely to the player to intuit the correct order of events and then interpret them. Something which is further complicated when you realize that you're not even required to find all of those scattered lumps of lore. Given how subtle some of these story items can be, you'd be entirely forgiven for overlooking them, either entirely or until you find yourself revisiting a segment. Honestly, it was to the point that I actually found myself briefly stuck, if only because I'd failed to find a key that I needed in order to progress further. That said, I'd place this as a mild annoyance at worst, as while the game is a walking simulator, the process of combing over the island never felt exhausting. There isn't much insofar as wasted space, and the gradual trickle of both additional areas to investigate alongside shifts in weather helped to keep me on my toes. And all of these points help to reinforce the overarching importance of the flashlight, which is not only helpful for lighting up those dark and stormy evenings, it's also incredibly useful for hunting through houses. That is, provided you're savvier than me as to its overall lifespan, because sure, the recharge points are easy to use, but the actual act of wandering through the dark to get to them is a lot more harrowing than I would have expected. Something which was no doubt exacerbated by the haunting sound design, which really helped to inject an overarching sense of disquiet to my journey. That's not to think that I think the Moon Sliver is a flawless experience. There's definitely some jank involving the text in some segments, such as when you're adjacent to multiple story locations or objects, which can break immersion as the text just sort of melds on the screen. That said, I only encountered these moments sporadically, so it wasn't too difficult to let myself get reeled back into the air of mystery I was trying to cultivate. Ultimately, while this game does lean towards being a bit on the short side, it does a decent job of providing a neat narrative-focused horror experience without relying on cheap scare tactics, and that's why at the end of the day, whether you're a fan of horror, suspense, or just want a curiously told tale to trundle through, I can safely recommend this title as a hit, which brings us to our next title, The Music Machine. For some people, the idea of a remote and desolate island might serve to elicit some degree of trepidation, even before factoring in the terrible rash of mysterious murders that had taken place on it. And yet it does nothing to dissuade the young Haley from combing its shores in search of the truth. Though it might be disingenuous to imply Haley has any choice in the matter, given she's currently serving as host to Quentin, a particularly vengeful ghost piloting her every action with a particularly unpleasant agenda in mind. One which sees the pair delving into the dark secrets at the heart of the island and lesser-known shores besides. In a similar vein to the last title, The Music Machine is another narrative-focused game, and yet there are some distinct differences in its execution. For one thing, the protagonists inhabited state means there's a lot more room for dialogue, which provides the game an adequate venue for both exposition and character building as you wander along. In fact, it wouldn't be hyperbole to say that the ultimate focus of the narrative is on the dynamic between Haley and her polter pal. There's honestly a lot to unpack on that front, enough so that by the time I'd learned more of their shared past and the actions which catalyzed the situation, I wasn't quite sure I'd call Quentin so much vindictive as seeking vindication. Though, that might not be the same for everyone, given it's a non-linear experience for one thing, and while there are certainly a few things a player is obliged to do in order to get to the end of the game, it's entirely possible to miss out on quite a fair number of details. There's heaps of optional dialogue to be found by traveling to certain locations or by poking around at various objects scattered around, providing further insight into the characters' backstories, personalities, and the island at large. All of which serve to ultimately guide my hand at the game's climax, since there are a pair of endings to pursue as well. But how is the journey itself? Well, the Music Machine is a walking simulator, like its predecessor, with a general focus on exploration and a light dash of puzzle solving. Mostly, this comes in the form of finding items in order to progress, but there is a clever organ puzzle I enjoyed figuring out, which also serves to introduce players to the real meat and mystery at the core of the game. Because, comparatively, the Music Machine is a lot larger than the Moon Sliver. Courtesy of a rather particular device, you'll find yourself introduced to a rather distinct series of domains to explore. Alien vistas, if you will, full of peculiar sights, deep lore to discover, and a flavor of deeply unpleasant, distinct to each one. And honestly, it is an experience, as the game's uncanny aesthetic style helps to further set each area apart and accentuate their respective vibe. That said, while I certainly found the visual decisions interesting, it was the sound that really helped to sell the experience to me. It's really good for setting the overall mood. In fact, it was distracting enough that I didn't even notice that I was a bit slidier than normal in these places until a fair amount of time had passed. And so, it really shouldn't come as a surprise when I say that out of these three titles, the Music Machine is my favorite. It provides an altogether interesting journey, replete with moments that are touching, uncomfortable, or which coax kernels of dread realization to take hold. It builds a world that is equal parts foreboding and yet fascinating to explore, and so I'd definitely say this title is a solid hit. That said, if you're intending on trying out the Moon Sliver, I would suggest playing this one after, given there's a hidden link between the two games which makes this close to a stealth sequel. Which brings us to the final game of the day, and no, it's not this. I just really enjoy this wholesome secret area. Welcome to A Wolf in Autumn. Good girls listen to their mothers. Good girls stay put. Good girls don't touch anything, or the wolves will get them. A Wolf in Autumn is, at its core, the story of a girl in an uncomfortable place. Whether it's the shed she's initially locked inside or the isolated stretch of woods that she emerges into, she's always alone, with her sole companionship coming in the form of distant wolf cries and a curious machine which provides messages from an absent mother.
Everything is going to be fine. Just do as I say.
Messages which grow more dire as the girl continues to explore her surroundings.
What part of don't go into the basement don't you understand? I've tried being nice, and apparently you're too stupid for nice. So get back in your little shed and wait there, quietly, until I decide what to do with you. Or do you want to die?
If this sounds weird as a premise, I can assure you it's even odder in execution. The intro, for instance, starts out with prose, seeks into a nightmarish vision of a house, then an idyllic beach, before ultimately dropping you into the aforementioned shed. Admittedly, of the titles, this is the most linear of the three, as while there are bits of item-related lore to discover, most of it comes from progressing through the game's puzzles and listening to miffed missives from the motherly machine.
Do I have to pry off your kneecaps, you little shit?
And I think that's in part how the game plays out. A Wolf in Autumn is a much more condensed experience than its peers, a relatively bite-sized point-and-click puzzler. But here's the thing. While it's certainly more focused on providing players a smaller playground of items to interact with, I wasn't really as engaged. Save for a pipe puzzle, the crux of the experience could be described as a salvage sifter simulator, as you'll find yourself rummaging through the accumulated detritus scattered about the camp in order to find the right item for whatever you're interested in clicking on. And I do mean it, given there is a plethora of objects just littering the area, many of which are just identical and potentially red herrings, whose sole purpose is ambience. Something which is made even more frustrating by the simple fact that the game's fairly dark. It was legitimately difficult at times for me to look around and find the things I was actually looking for at times. And given that the protagonist can only carry one object at a time, I'd occasionally find myself having to run around the campsite with a lighter or a flashlight looking for what I needed. Or thought I needed, by the way, since after a bit of juggling where I dropped the flashlight, snag my new item, and run over to the interaction point, I discovered that I had, in fact, acquired garbage, and was now obliged to make my back to where I'd hopefully placed a flashlight so I could then move on to try and find what I was actually looking for. Really, my big saving grace here was the simple fact that the object puzzles are surprisingly open-ended, and most solutions that you think could work are actually viable. Yeah, no, like, this actually astounded me. For instance, right at the start, this door that I picked with an ice pick, inside that same room, I failed to notice that there was a balloon with a key on it and a pair of scissors helpfully nearby. I didn't even notice that balloon until I went back and watched this recording. But still, I hated the fact that the darkness was such a big part of the aesthetic, even when you're outside. Not even the decent voice acting or the solid soundtrack could make the process of trying to find a misplaced flashlight fun. Or the fact that at one point I found myself needing to illuminate a yard with the flicker of a lighter. Yeah, just flicking that flint and praying I can find the thing I wanted. And I think that's really my ultimate takeaway from the experience. While there's certainly interesting ideas at the heart of A Wolf in Autumn, with its creepy story and at times surreal presentation, I was perpetually distracted by the process of sitting in the dark, sifting through piles of trash, and also just overlooking a pipe for 10 minutes. That was literally a thing, and I despise myself for it, since I probably would have finished this title in 20 or 30 minutes otherwise. And that's ultimately the thing. Whilst I would strongly recommend the other games in his narrative bundle, Iron Lung included, by the way, since that is actually in there, I found A Wolf in Autumn a tedious enough process to call this a fail. It's an interesting story, yes, but it's bundled in a gameplay experience that never quite hits home, and which I can't see myself telling others to play unless they were absolutely compelled to experience all of his games. I honestly would have just been fine reading this as a small vignette. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreons. You can support me and my editor, Hop Instead of Jump. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.